Good afternoon. Thanks for those who are still staying for this important, I think, panel on MOOC in developing economies. As you know, there are a lot of potential mission of MOOCs. The one which we've talked a lot is the enhanced learning experience, and this is certainly a plus, but this will not change probably the face of the world. There's this life learning experience, which I think is something quite important that is upcoming. But I think for me, I'm personally passionate by it. I think one of the biggest potential of MOOCs is outreach for developing countries. I spent the last 6 months, I took a sabbatical as a president of EPFL. Just after our first MOOC was aired, I looked at the IP address and I saw dots in Africa for a very sophisticated course on programming language called Scala. And for me, seeing those dots in Rwanda, Uganda, South Sudan one, I thought that something is happening and ought to be looked at seriously. So that's why I think that this subject need to be discussed. And for this, we have 4 distinguished panelists. I'll take it from the right on, and we'll get them to follow this order. Mrs. Yang Yu. She's the Director of Education at the Vocational, an interactive information technology company based in China. And her recent work was focusing on publishing MOOC in China. As we know, the potential in China is huge, and I think it'll be very interesting to hear what she has to say about that. The second panelist will be Chandrika Bahadur. She's the Director of Education Initiatives of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, based in New Delhi, closely linked with Colombia, and she will give us a broad view, not only from India, but for the rest of the world, of the potential of MOOCs. The third speaker will be Sheila Jagannathan. She's the head of the E-Institute of the World Bank. I thought it was very interesting to hear that the World Bank has aired a first MOOC, Turn Down the Heat. And I think this is something that we would probably not thought of, that the World Bank would put a MOOC together. And I think they're now thinking about other potential courses on health, on sanitation, and hearing what the World Bank has to say, I think is going to be very interesting. And last speaker, but not least, is Gautam Shroff. He's the Vice President and Chief Scientist of Tata Consulting, as a very big corporation in India. And I think what is also interesting, not only from a company, but I understand that he has an adjunct professorship at one of the IIT, the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology, and he has taught a course himself on big data and intelligence. And I think this is going to be also, he will probably also describe the Indian perspective. So I think we have really people that are very much at the heart of what we want to talk about, which is really the potential of MOOCs with 2 major countries, continent being China and India, but also the rest of the world. So with this said, I will give the floor first to Mrs. Yang Yu.
Thanks, Patrick, for the introduction. Well, just as Patrick introduced, my company based in Beijing, but today's topic is MOOCs in developing world. So we're also working with some rural areas in China, but it's not the main theme of my talk. But if you're interested, you can ask me afterwards. I come from Guoke. I put a walnut here because it means, Guoke literally means nutshell. We want to open the nutshell of knowledge so that people can enjoy. Guoke started in 2010. It is the most popular SNS in China that shares science and knowledge. People may know that 2012 is said to be the year of MOOC. We think that the spirit of MOOC is perfectly in line with our mission, so we started our MOOC initiative at the end of 2012, hoping the Chinese society can also benefit from this model. We launched our online MOOCs community, and we call it MOOC Academy. You can see it on the bottom of the slides. Just to be clear, because I think my background is is different from most of you, we don't make course videos and we don't put the videos directly onto our platform, but we are collecting the course information from all kinds of MOOC providers such as Coursera, edX, Iversity, and FutureLearn, everything. And we introduce those courses in Chinese so that to help the Chinese students to learn those lessons better and help them to choose the course. We developed some basic functions like a basic online product so that they can share their lecture notes and reviews and talk about class materials easily. After those basic functions, we did a huge survey last year to ask what are the biggest problems for the students, for the learners to learn through MOOCs. From the result, a lot of them complain that they don't have enough time and they are not satisfied with their persistence. They face huge language barrier. They want classmates and also they need help choosing the right course. So we focus on effort on helping the students to cope with those problems. Last September, Guoke and Coursera formed official collaboration on translation. Back then, we only have 20 translators, and now we recruited 400 volunteers who have already translated 50 courses. This really helped so many people. And in order to give them classmates, we also applied for the official collaboration on learning hubs. So what we did is we convinced the big companies in Beijing to ask them to lend us their spare offices for run these learning hubs for free. And we also collaborated with the biggest real estate developer in China so that we open learning hubs in their residential community. You can see, so every time we run these learning hubs there, you can see a combination of audience. So on the left side, it's the first lecture course that we run is child nutrition. The other one is irrational behavior. So a grandma and a pregnant woman and housewife and mom with child all come to this child nutrition. It's really a new audience to MOOC Academy. So our learners are very creative too, because as you know, China is very big and not all of our learners are in big cities and in Beijing. So they cannot come to the real learning hubs. That's why we started an e-version of learning hubs as well. They basically do the same thing, but they are putting everything online, like introducing the course and the teacher, and they have an individual post to discuss every week's class material. They are being very serious there. They have an online registration form. Now, this course, for example, have 700 to 800 registered learners. So last, I want to talk about localization because I think a lot of people have a little bit misunderstanding on that. We, from a Chinese perspective, we think that localization is not only about translation from English to Chinese, it's also helping the students to adapt to the Western learning style. It is because the curriculum is different, so it's very important to build up a community that allows the communication between students as well as between the students and the teacher. It really makes a dramatic change, and the students appreciate those communication. Right now, there are 400,000 Chinese MOOCers. More than half are registered users on Guoke. They spend 50 minutes every day on our site. And in general, Chinese people tend to take more courses. We think that MOOC can be an e-version of university, and we hope all the students will like to spend more time on this campus. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will not walk back here. So if I can now ask Mrs. Chandrika Bahadur just to give her introduction.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us here. What I want to talk about is a little bit different from what you've probably heard in the conference so far. I represent the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is not a university. It is a research network that was established in August 2012 at the request of the United Nations, and the aim was to bring together universities from around the world to support the UN with academic and technical and scientific advice as the UN decides and embarks on this process of designing the next set of development objectives, global development objectives, which it is in the process of doing and which will probably be done by the end of 2015. In that effort, most of these international efforts to design goals are largely technocratic and very often political negotiating processes. And the Secretary General felt that it would be useful to get the academic community involved, particularly in areas such as climate change, how to manage energy systems, water resources, which do require some technical knowledge and expertise. So that was the main purpose for which we were put together. And what we realized very quickly were a few things. The first thing we realized was that even if the world does come up with global objectives of eradicating poverty, improving water and sanitation, improving public health, who's actually going to do the work? It's not going to be the governments alone. And what we will need are young, trained people who over the next 2 or 3 decades will actually be able to solve some of these public good problems. And how do we do that? And that's really where the architecture of the network came very handy, because we realized that we have at our disposal both a fabulous pool of experts in each of these areas. And this is a very wide range of issues. When you think about sustainable development, it means so many different things to different people, but it's a very wide scope of topics. We have this expertise. At the same time, we have today over 100 members, and we're hoping to get to 1,000 in the next year and a half, 100 members of universities around the world, where there are students who are engaged in some way in learning about different aspects of sustainable development. And so what we wanted to put together was a way of creating very large numbers of what we are calling sustainable development practitioners, essentially young people studying to do various things, but getting expertise not just in individual topics of health or education or climate change, but understanding how these things work together and really melding that into a program. So how are we going to do that? We are in the process of bringing together a subset of our global experts to create MOOCs on each of these different areas, and we want to create a compendium of courses. We're doing 7 this year. We're aiming to do 8 next year. And we already have 1 that's running right now. So we're aiming for a total of about 16 courses that we can then stitch together into an online program once the new sustainable goals are in place and have been adopted by all member nations of the UN. And then we want to partner with our members to actually find a way of teaching these courses, not just as MOOCs open to everybody, but also in academic communities around the world. Why did we go down the route of MOOCs? And there are 4 very simple reasons. The first obvious one is of scale. I think when we've been talking about MOOCs at this conference, and all the presentations that I've been hearing have been talking about what a wonderful experience it is for individual students to be part of a global community. For us, it's very important that the topics that we're dealing with actually have a global community discussing them, because they are topics that are very vast and that mean different things in different parts of the world. So one great advantage is we'll have a large cohort of students around the world learning the same core material, but from their own lens, and that for us is extremely valuable. The second, of course, is cost. To be able to do this quickly, we needed the technology to be able to roll it out at a very low cost to our students. The third, and this is, I think, one of the most exciting things about the MOOCs for us, is that we are in a position now to be able to crowdsource the curriculum. We don't want this to be one-to-many model where there is one person who's considered a global expert who develops a curriculum and then it's taught by students around the world. We want the process of developing the content to be a collaborative one and a two-way process. So we want to learn from students around the world about what is the best water harvesting technique in that particular world, and that needs to feed into the course on safe drinking water and access to clean drinking water. So that's a third part why we want to do this. And finally, we are also seeing, and we're already seeing this in the MOOC that we're running right now, that one of the big advantages is that this improves university capacity across the world. So there are many institutions that want to offer courses in sustainable development, don't have the resources right now. We want the materials we produce to feed into those universities and to be available as resources for them. The first example that we are running right now is a course called The Age of Sustainable Development. It's offered on Coursera right now. It's running as we speak, offered by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And you can see here that the a large proportion of the students are from the developing world. Many of them are actually first-time computer users. We've got questions ranging from, well, I have gone to the Coursera link, but can you please register me? So there are all sorts of questions that are coming up. I work during the day. Can I take the course at night? And so there's a familiarity which is missing with the MOOC format, but there's also a lot of enthusiasm to actually get in there and learn. And the other surprising element that we're finding is how engaged these students are in their own communities, and they're creating their own Facebook pages, they're creating their own discussion fora, and we're seeing the start of a global community. I do think it's early days yet, but it's a good model. What is it that we're worried about? Well, the first thing is, what is our value proposition? At the end of the day, if we are offering courses to students with very different backgrounds, there have to be very clear value additions within the curriculum design of skills that the students are getting and knowledge that they're getting that they wouldn't get otherwise. We're very surprised by the student profile, lots of students, but the surprising thing for us is how many faculty have signed up for these courses. So we're seeing that we have a mix not just of students wanting to learn the material, but teachers who want to teach this material, and that affects how we design it. The pedagogical challenge of fairly technically rigorous material, but combined for a very wide audience and locally specific. That's very, very hard to do, and we're struggling with that right now. And the end game for us, therefore, is to be able to do this in conjunction with universities that are already running sustainable development programs, because that's how we believe we'll reach the numbers and the quality that we're aiming for. I think I'm over my time, so I'll stop now and happy to take questions.
Thank you. So I propose that we hear our third speaker, Mrs. Jan Ganathan.
Hi, everyone. I hope my presentation will complement the others coming from an international organization that works in emerging and developing countries. So 1.2 billion people continue to live in extreme poverty today. And we've had a new president about 18 months ago, and we have a new mandate for the World Bank. It's twin goals: ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. And he wants to achieve, he's calling it bending the arc of history, he wants to achieve this by 2030. So that is the goal. So where do MOOCs play a role? Knowledge. What are the key accelerators before I get to that? Learning, innovation, and collaboration are the key accelerators in eradicating poverty, especially in a finance-constrained environment. No longer are people coming for loans and infrastructure and buildings and roads, but they want to learn about what works, what doesn't, from each other, from peer learning, south to south, south to north, north to south, and so on. So knowledge is becoming crucial. We're moving to a solutions bank. What are those last mile solutions? How do people learn about it? What are the practitioner challenges in health, in urban, in competitiveness, in governance, and implementing the science of delivery, having an idea of those problems and having recommendations on the solutions. All in an integrated evidence-based way that is multi-stakeholder oriented and focuses on both global and local solutions. So if you look at it in the new paradigm, knowledge and learning is front, right, and center. And so that's where the MOOCs fit in. Just before I get to the MOOCs, I lead what we used to call an E-Institute. The World Bank has a capacity building arm called the World Bank Institute, and we're in the middle of the reorg, so that may change and evolve, but this is the capacity building arm. Our clients, our target audience, are practitioners, policymakers in developing countries, government officials. Along with that, there's private sector, NGOs, youth, but the primary audience are the government officials who make these policies in health and climate change. We run this E-Institute. Even 10 years ago, most of the training used to be face-to-face. 2 weeks, bring government officials to Washington for 2 weeks, 1 month, long course, etc. We moved to e-learning about 10 years ago. We have facilitated e-learning on about over 200 topics, where it's a 4 to 6 week course where the world's best experts, both from Washington, but worldwide regional experts and so on, who are there to mentor, guide, coach, online, purely virtual. We do webinars, we do self-paced courses, we do games, we do a whole bunch of other things. Now, we started the first MOOC in January this year on Turn Down the Heat, and it came at a moment when the need for climate action was critical, and the MOOC provided a platform to understand the vital scientific basis of the risk and devastating impacts of climate change if people don't do anything about it. So key features included videotapes of 18 top leading experts. It was based on a report commissioned by the bank, but created by the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, which is where the best research are working. Now, compared to 40, 50, 60,000, because this was a niche, we only got about 20,000, but people were very actively engaged, and we have had about 80% completion rate. I'll quickly go to the opportunities we learned. One, the MOOC allowed us to go beyond our traditional audience. So our traditional audience was government officials. We reached out to 3 streams. We reached out to government officials, we reached out to the general global public who need to do something about climate change, and we reached out to our staff, 10,000 of them worldwide, who needed to have a better integrated program for helping countries on climate change. I told you about the statistics. What we did find, which is unlike many MOOCs, is 60% of the people who attended this MOOC were from emerging countries, which is quite different from what Coursera. That's also probably because we did very extensive marketing. We had Facebook pages in Africa and Philippines and so on and so forth. And the course was rated very high, 4 out of 5, and it contributed significantly to raising awareness, advocacy on climate action, and also achieving the development benefits. Some of the content, as I mentioned, it was based on scientific research, but packaged in a very practical storytelling way of what works, what doesn't, what does a policymaker need to do. We had 2 tracks. We had the policy and the leadership track, and we had the climate champion track. So so that people could attach, ownership. I'm a citizen, so let me go to the climate champ track. I'll find other people in that. The pedagogy, of course, we had global and regional facilitators. We catered to a transgenerational aspect, use of social media, and so on. For us, even more than learning, the forging connections was very important so that people could then continue. So the Map Yourself feature allowed them to identify city, country, organization, and forming of subgroups, and then spontaneous communities. And, this MOOC and many of our other MOOCs are going to be more on the call for action, advocacy, act now, act together, act differently at an individual, organization, and a community level. And unfortunately, I can't play this, but one was a very poignant song that somebody wrote from Africa. He created the lyrics, he strummed the guitar, and created a movie out of the song on calling for action on climate change. So we felt that, because the last project was one on a digital artifacts on what the key takeaways. So I see a lot of potential for MOOCs. The next one is going to be on risks and opportunities, launching on July 1. We have one on health systems coming up, sanitation, public-private partnerships, and so on. These are for us and organizations like that. This is for large awareness raising, advocacy, and connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the last talk will be given by, the last introduction by Mr. Schroff.
Good afternoon. I'm preceded by some fantastic presentations from some very articulate ladies, and I'll try to cover my experience, which has been more traditional than what we've heard so far, in the sense that I'm author of one of the Coursera MOOCs, but I'm also have a full-time job in industry, and I'm no longer a professor, though I used to be. I represent a different perspective as well, because TCS as a company last year recruited 50,000 people, and we were probably one of the largest employers in the country, in the private sector. So that's a different perspective. So I'll bring that perspective in as well. So my experience has been from way back when MOOCs were young. In August 2012, the development started in April, when there were probably 10 MOOCs on Coursera. I talked to Daphne and got this going. Ran this 3 times. It has a catchy title, so it had a lot of people coming in. 34,000 the first time, 50,000 next time, 40,000 third time, fourth time. I haven't run it so far. I'm trying to figure out whether it's gotten old right now. It probably has. It was also offered for credit at the IIT, where I'm an adjunct faculty. And the experience has been quite phenomenal. And I'll share a couple of main points over there a little later. The second thing is about what else is happening in India. After many stops and starts, the government and the ministry and the IITs got together and decided that they need to do something and create a MOOC. This sort of happened about a year and a half ago. It started, and now NPTEL is something called the National Program for Technology Enabled Learning, run by the government, and pretty much all the courses of the top institutes are available as open courseware, but they are 40-hour full lecture, 1-hour lecture videos, just like MIT OpenCourseware, etc. Now they have just launched last month a basic course in computer science targeted at non-computer science students aspiring to join the industry, and we have, along with other industry partners, have helped with the curriculum, not with the teaching. The teaching has been by the professors, and NASSCOM, which is the industry body of the IT industry, has agreed to recognize this certificate. It's a MOOC on basic computer science, and there's an exam at the end of it, which is a national exam, which is not separate from the exams which go inside the course. And that's the point which is important, I think. In India, the national exams, the national certification is much more easily recognized by industry and other employers than the certificates which come out of the MOOCs themselves. So that's how it's happening. The certificate comes out from IIT, so that's also drawing a lot of people. Last I heard, which was last week, about 50,000 people are in this course. We don't know how many are going to actually give the exam and how many are going to pass. But that's second data point. Other experiences in India, well, there have been other local experiences, not as many as I would have hoped a year and a half ago or 2 years ago. But people have developed small MOOCs for a few hundred students for a fee. Use it at IIT Kanpur, for example. They have developed a larger MOOCs for maybe a few thousand students for free. And they're using their home crafted platforms like Sakai, e-learning platform, plus YouTube videos. It seems to work. It doesn't have the reach or the brand that Coursera has. The other thing which is important is that I experimented with some live tutorials to augment my course, because the course was also offered for credit, and what we were doing in class was just tutorials physically. So we wanted to replicate that at scale synchronously to a large audience. Did not really work. Technology didn't work well enough. I was using a startup company. There's another one now which I'm going to try to use. So I think this is important. How do we scale the live experience, especially for the local content or local augmentation of global content, something which we need to think about, at least in India. Many people are not aware of MOOCs. Many people are, even if they are, they don't see the linkage between what they're learning in the MOOC and their local curriculum, which might be outdated, might be just differently targeted, might be requires a certain degree of maturity to explain what the MOOC is teaching versus what they're being asked in the exam. There is a linkage, but they don't see it. Right? Some IITs have tied up with edX, which is fine. I think edX and Coursera are all equally good. edX is exploiting this concept of being non-profit in terms of signing up things with the institute. They haven't really seen any courses yet, but hopefully something will come. A broader picture, free and open MOOCs. On the one hand, education is pretty much for free if you really want it. We have 600 more universities, more than 4,000 engineering colleges. Entrance to the top colleges is extremely difficult. 3 years ago, one of the top colleges in Delhi only admitted students who had 100% marks in their school leaving exam, and nothing less. I mean, it's crazy. So there is a 1 in 50 chance of getting into an IIT. At the same time, continuing educations from an open university are not regarded at all good, but MOOCs are highly sought after. So what's the conundrum here? The challenge is, what I've come to the conclusion is that it's all about brand, and brand has two pieces. There's content, so the brand content comes from the universities, whether it's a Stanford, a Berkeley, or an IIT, and there's peer group, which is independent of content. So this particular university might have been good, but certainly it's not in the category of a Stanford or MIT. But the peer group, just because it's so difficult to jump through the hoops to get in, that itself is valuable, and that the MOOCs are now going to replace. The hoops are going to be there, people will compete, and that peer group is going to remain. But content as a brand is the key which we're trying to look at. Lastly, let me talk about the employer side perspective, which I promised. We recruit a lot of people, and our experience is that apart from the top institutes, which we clearly recognize are differentiated and different, degrees are a very poor indicator of the quality of students. So the performance, as we see 5 years down the road, we see absolutely no correlation between where there's the correlation coefficient is 0 in industry between where somebody came from, graduated versus what they did. Yes, take the top performer from an IIT, yes, you'll see a reasonable correlation. Not great, but it's there. So what you do in industry doesn't necessarily correlate with the brand where you came from. And so you need some other way of measuring this, and I think from employer perspective, MOOCs have a role to play. Motivating students is very important. Faculty's role is critical, and those students who have had decent faculty to physically interact with are the ones who really end up doing well. That's what we found actually. I mean, if they did self-learning or something, they go up to a point, but they can't, ending. So from the employer perspective, we may be giving preference to people who have done MOOCs, but that's a work in progress. It's not a formal certification yet, and we haven't really crossed that barrier. It's certainly good for our own employees to do continuing education, and obviously for in-house training. You still need a degree, and in a lighter vein, at least you need a degree to get a passport and a visa, so they're not going away. Degrees will remain, as long as Fortran remains probably, but it's going to stay for a while. But I think that's our experience. I would have liked to say more, but hopefully there will be more coming out of India in the future. Thank you.
Does it work? No. So I'll try to speak loudly. First, I'd like to thank all our speakers for, I think, was quite very fascinating introduction. Maybe I'll take the prerogative of the moderator to ask 1 or 2 questions, and then I'll open it to the floor. But maybe you've all spoke about different issues of how to penetrate this into the developing world. None of you really spoke about, I would say, access issues, bandwidth. If you're in the middle of Africa, cost. Do you need learning hubs? We say this is massive. We have, the possibility. There's a thirst for a lot of people. But what about access? Is that an issue or not?
I think not only in Africa. In China we have this firewall. So none of the edX video can be viewed directly because it's on YouTube. So people should either download it or have some way to overcome those firewall issue. So even if we have internet, it's still a problem. So what we're doing right now is we are negotiating with those platforms. So we want to have a copy of those videos and put it in our server so that Chinese people can view it directly. Yeah.
My quick response would be that it is an issue, of course, in most developing countries, but it's an issue that's going to get easier over time. So it's a with the access, and particularly now with a lot of these MOOCs being available on mobile devices, and since that movement is happening anyway, this problem is going to get solved at some point in the future. It is very much there right now. The other point I want to make is that there are also a very large proportion of potential learners who do have access. So even in every developing country, if you look at the top 10, top 15 cities, even with spotty access and with the variation of availability, there's enough of an untapped market even today. Yes, when you talk about remote rural locations, that problem remains and is likely to remain for a while.
Sure. Very rural areas, yes, it could be a problem, but what we found, and again, I'm speaking also from the experience of pre-MOOC over the last 10 years, it's really how you design it. You can design it very cleverly for lower bandwidth without losing the quality, and then accompaniments of those days it used to be CD-ROM, now we put it on YouTube, iTunes, available mobile. So you make it available in different ways. Earlier we would be less reliant on video, but what I found very surprisingly is we did a study of the smaller e-learning courses, and there have been a lot of participation from Africa and bandwidth constraints, so I don't see that. And the MOOC, particularly Coursera, has a lot of video compression techniques that make it easier for people to access. So I don't think access is such a huge thing right now, especially with the addition of the hubs and the meetups and so on.
I think access is a problem in rural areas and smaller towns, but we have about more than 500,000, maybe 750,000 people graduating as engineers every year. And I still meet people who say, I can't get a job, can you get me a job? I get such a conversation every couple of days because of who we are. And I said, have you done any MOOCs? What's MOOC? People still ask that question, even in big cities. So the awareness is a bigger problem still, and it just needs to penetrate more.
Maybe my second last before I put it to the floor is, you've given examples of, I would say, high-level courses, which I think is very important that those people in the rest of the world can access. But also, if you look at traveling in Africa, what was fairly obvious for me, there was a real need for, I would say, vocation training courses, type of courses. And the question now, we see Coursera, we say the 200 best universities, whatsoever. We will not probably be the ones that can, train the plumbers, the carpenters, the whatever, that is, very much needed in those countries. So who will do it? Is the World Bank, thinking about those issues, or how are we going to go and provide, this kind of education that is very much needed? I'm not saying that the one we provide is not, but, who will be responsible of putting this vocation training?
So my ex-boss is, at least still is, a cabinet minister. He's a minister in charge of advising the Prime Minister on skill development. And the goal is to skill up 500 million people by 2020. And it's an ambitious target, and of course he has government and he has budget, but still it's a big mess. And what they're trying to do is put videos of things exactly what you said, carpentry, welding, soldering, and stuff like that. First on a simple YouTube-like platform, just as a resource. Who's making them? It's the industries like Tata Motors, Tata Chemicals, other Larsen & Toubro, people who want the skills. So it's really getting those people to make these videos and say, oh, let's put them available, it's going to help you. Everything in India moves very slowly. It started probably a year ago. There are some videos out there, probably not publicized at all, much less than Coursera, but that's one direction we're moving in.
There's also a category of work in the middle between the high-level academic courses and the vocational courses, which is the space that we are looking at, which is who's going to train the next generation of urban planners in developing countries, who's going to train the next generation of energy company workers who really understand what the requirements are at the grassroots, who's going to train the next generation of primary school teachers, public health workers. That does not require an advanced university degree, but it requires very real skills that right now nobody is looking at these sectors in the numbers that are required. So I think that is another big gap. I don't see any effort in that direction in a consistent way, I would say, across the developing world. And I know it's a broad statement to make.
And who should be responsible? Because, as much as we have been in university, it's a bottom-up system. So, whoever is interested, in, at least until now, maybe we'll get to a second point where we'll have, senior administration will have to say, we need to coordinate a little bit of this. But when you go to this kind of education, who would be either the countries, that's, NGOs, who should be in charge of putting those kind of courses together?
I don't think there's any one person, any one group that will eventually do it. I suspect it'll be a little bit of there'll be initiative shown in some cases by a few governments, in some cases by some large organizations. Maybe the World Bank will do this. And eventually, if this catches on, I think that the critical bit is really the value we deliver to the students at the end of the day. So if a student does sign up for a program and learns through several MOOCs to become a great urban planner, and nobody hires that person, or the sort of job they get is exactly what they would have got had they not gone through that program, it won't work. So the value proposition is very important.
At least speaking from India's perspective, I don't think anybody's in charge anyway for anything. So.
Now, I want to bring an interesting experience because Chandrika brings a good point. And while the World Bank is not doing everything, in one area of similar things in the energy sector or the urban development or the climate change or so on, we are bringing out open educational resources for professionalization, not the basic stuff, but if you want to manage these sectors, what are the skills you need? But it is also incentives and attitude, because we've been trying to work with the government sector in India for a while, meeting the head of personnel and so on. And working with institutes like ASCII and Yashoda and so on. Same time, I started working with the Chinese government, the Chinese Academy of Government, the Ministry of Finance, the HRDC. Same time. Now, China has set a goal, they've implemented it. And for example, our land use planning, set of open material, transport planning, a lot of urban courses are now being reached, which they have completely localized, not just translated, are being reached out to 50,000 people and very effective, and they want to do more. So again, it's what our colleague said, it's also the incentives, because when we go, I don't see much of an uptake for e-learning at all from the government. We're also in touch with the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy. There's not so much the preference for conferences and attending meetings. And of course, so basically what you mentioned is what is the value that they see for their own personal and career growth?
I think the key is, one of the important components of education, just one, is to get a job. And that once that gets linked tightly, nicely to things that you can earn from a MOOC, credibly, then a lot more pickup will be there. Right now, that link is a little tenuous.
This is you.
I'm sorry, I don't know whether I understand your question right, but I think we cannot ask education to do everything. And in China, just as you guys mentioned just now, people don't want to be carpenter or farmers anymore. They don't want to learn those skills. They just want to go to school and learn get accepted to bigger universities, and they want to go to cities. So actually, but that's my, we wish to teach them how to survive, but they don't really, they want to seek for equal opportunities. So.
Okay, so let's open it to the audience. Any questions? Yes.
I'm Eng Chai Tan from Singapore. Just interested in knowing the characteristics of Indian and Chinese who have completed MOOCs.
Yeah, I've interviewed. I interview a lot of people anyway, because as part of the responsibility that everybody has from top to bottom. I've interviewed many people who say they've done MOOCs. I've interviewed people who say they've done MOOCs, have not got a certificate. I've said that people have got a certificate when it's absolutely clear that they don't know, they have not done the course. Right? So there's a huge spectrum, and that's why we have this bit of a doubt at the moment.
But down the road, do you think, will you, if that's corrected, can you imagine that a MOOC for an employer will be something that you would really take into consideration?
Absolutely. So then, like the national certification that we're talking about will be taken into certification, because it's will be nationally conducted exam, properly proctored. There's no question of people leaking the question paper beforehand, or that we'll make sure of that, just like we do it for all the other exams in the country. So I think a degree of in the US, I found I had 50,000 students, and most of them from the US. A lot of them were there to learn, and I really find that heartening. But I can tell you, a lot of people from India are there to learn, but also to get a job, and they'll do anything if it's going to be recognized. So we have to police it some way.
Other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to say, when we were talking before about vocation, you also mentioned teachers. The Coursera does have teaching partners as well. We're one of them, the Commonwealth Education Trust, and we're running one of their specializations, which is a foundation course, which is a slight misnomer, but it's a foundation course in teaching for learning. It's a basic teacher education, and that is aimed at the developing world. So Coursera is doing something, and we're one of their partners on that.
Excellent.
Can I just make a point about accreditation, which has come up a little bit? This is one of the big minefields for us at the SDSN, because we are trying to bring content from different countries to other different countries, and every country has very different regulatory environments around learning and recognizing online education. So in our country, for example, you can't offer a degree program which is online, which basically means that there needs to be a local brick and mortar affiliation for anyone who wants an actual degree. Similarly, whether or not diplomas are recognized, whether or not individual courses are recognized, and not everything can be tied to jobs. So where the content of the course lends itself immediately into a work environment, it's relatively straightforward. There the recruiter plays that role and does the sorting. Where that is not the case, the students have no incentive to do the course. I mean, they may do it because for the love of learning and because they want that brand name on their resume, but they will not be able to use that as a way to bolster their academic credentials unless there is some recognition. So one of the things that we are exploring now is to see if we can work with a couple of the international organizations to think about not digital badges, because I don't think that substitutes for what we're trying to achieve, but some protocols that allow for recognition of degrees across countries, which may not be recognized by national governments, but are recognized internationally in some global protocol, because I think that's a big gap right now.
There was a bill pending in Parliament for at least 3 years, foreign universities bill, right? Of course, it's going to lapse now because Parliament is dissolved. There's going to be elections, so a new bill will come, and we will hope that many of you from universities, and I think Georgia Tech and a few others, have actually invested in looking at trying to set up a presence in India. And I think that was 4 or 5 years ago, and now I think the online component is going to become a very important part of that legislation, and let's see how that goes.
Just another aspect, which is the culture. A lot of those courses are taught by, I would say, Western institutions and so on. I understand that, Mrs. Yul, that you are translating the courses. To which extent do you think that the developing world will go and produce, its own courses with its own culture, its own language, or are we going to normalize the world, let's say, by having 100 institutions that will provide 95% of the courses? Are we going to allow diversity? Do you see this as an opportunity, or do you think that because of time and speed, it'll be difficult not to be taught by only one culture?
So whether it's MOOC or not, in the context of the open educational resources, we're taking this attitude of the the Lego block approach, build learning objects so that there is some global perspective. If you look at urban, there are certain concepts that are built with content and interactive exercises and so on from a global perspective. But then what we are finding is you take an urban toolkit on urban management, and countries are then adding their own modules, because transportation will not, there'll be some global principles, but there will be certain concepts and learning that has to happen in India and China and Brazil and so on. So that's very much how you build in a very modular way, so that, because otherwise that learning becomes meaningless if you want to apply it to a local context. So I think from the design perspective, we really have to be open about making it more modular and allow different types of customization, not just translation.
This is a great question, and I think actually that at least in the short term, knowledge will congregate from where it is at the front lines, is my sense. So it doesn't all mean that it will all be produced, will all flow from the Western world to developing countries, but where that is the cutting edge, that is how it will flow. Because part of the challenge is, it's not just the numbers. Daphne spoke yesterday about how India needs 1,500 new universities, but the existing universities also lack tremendously in quality. So there, it's going to come from one direction. But there's the other side also, where we are in conversation with the director of the Sustainability Institute of the Amazonia state in Brazil, where they have done some very interesting work of working with local communities who live in the forest. And he wants to create a course on how to actually help these communities get employment, livelihoods, because in his words, this is going to help all countries where there are tropical rainforests and tribal communities living in them. So that's where the repository of knowledge is, so it will flow from there. I do think over time, if this model works, there will be some sort of a normalization, at which point the knowledge can flow from anywhere. But I don't see that happening immediately, because the quality difference, at least in certain areas, is quite high.
And just to build on what Chandrika said, it's not just on the codified knowledge, but also on the tacit. Because what we are finding, one of the what we found even from our very first MOOC on Turn Down the Heat, there's a lot of South-South learning going on, and networks forming and people exchanging ideas and so on, which have given us fodder for the next version of the course. So there's a lot of tacit knowledge being created through the dialogues and social media and the Google Hangouts and so on as well.
Is it you?
Sorry, I think from last year I went to Qatar to attend the WISE Education Summit, and I listened to what George Siemens said, which shocked me. He was said to be the father of MOOC. So at that time, the audience was asking him, how can you solve the internet problem for us? How can you deliver those class material to our region? But George is very straightforward. He said, why you are asking me for that? You have to think of a way to solve the problem yourself. Everybody only think about importing education resource, but not exporting. So he was like, he was very harsh on that. He was like, so, but I totally agree with that. From our statistics, most of the Chinese people likes the course that's taught in their native language. And the most popular teachers in our MOOC Academy are 2 Chinese teachers, and also the 2 teachers from National Taiwan University. So even if, although they want to learn English through MOOC, that's a big motive, but still they feel very friendly when they're taking lessons by their own language. And also, I was thinking that about, you said to have a standard, something like that, but I think for STEM, it's okay when you're talking about science project. When you're talking about biology and mathematics, it's okay, but for things like literature and history, how can you normalize those courses? Because in Chinese perspective, it may be different from the Western world. So I believe in diversity, and I don't think any country or any platform can rule the world.
I think it's going to happen. Currently, the awareness is bottom up. Faculty, researchers, scholars are less aware than their students. So they will become aware, their students will tell them, what the hell are you doing, why aren't you making MOOCs? And that's when they'll wake up.
In China, it's a big trend. Every top university are starting to make their own MOOCs, and they are very proud of it. I was talking to Xiaoming Li yesterday, and he said, "We are the number one." He's from Peking University, and he said, "We have half of the Chinese courses on our platform." So I think it's a trend, and it will definitely happen. And also, I think that lady brought up an interesting question, and should we?
Any other question? Yes.
I have a question. I'm from Leiden University in the Netherlands. I was just wondering if you could expand on this more, like on a, you put it, concrete questions that you have for universities are now developing MOOCs in terms, I think, I'm feeling there's a bit of miscommunication. We're developing MOOCs in terms of, people can just take MOOCs, but I'm hearing you talk accreditation is important. We want modular MOOCs that we can expand on. Our target audience are professionals, teachers, administrators. Well, as far as I know, my university is targeting individuals and people are just intrinsically motivated to learn themselves. What would you ask of, for example, Leiden University to make MOOCs really helpful? Sorry, for you.
I think, let me speak from the employer perspective. I think I've thought about it a lot. I was very excited about MOOCs, and I still am, but I was much more, let's put it, starry-eyed a few years back. And I realized after interviewing people who have done MOOCs that it's almost like somebody saying, I read 3 books. You still have to make sure. Right, and yes, the self-learner is very important, but if somebody has passed a national competitive exam and is ranked 5th in the country, well, that counts for something. It may not count for a lot, but it counts for something. From an employer perspective, dealing with scale, we have to look at things beyond the, we have to look at some systematic way of.
But don't you think that, when talking about developing countries, the Indian problem is very different than if you talk at my little experience in Africa. You have outstanding institutions like the IITs, you have those national competition, you know how to select the best, and you have some very high-tech companies that can employ those people. And I would say this is developed industry maybe in developing countries. I think we're talking about Africa, and access, bandwidth, major issue. Even having the tablets, they don't have them, So they have to go to spaces, to places, and so on. And you have a couple of very bright young individuals that can take, your high-level courses. But also there's a huge need, for basic vocational training. And it's very difficult for the country to work if you don't have that, because as soon as you get educated, you go to the second level, but you still don't have your basic electricians that you need to run your hospitals. Those are the kind of things that are very obvious when you go to developing countries. So I think, when we're talking about developing countries, you have a perspective here of highly, advanced developing countries. And certainly India, China, those are, sure, there are rural areas and so on. We have them some also in Europe. But I think you're talking a very different problem if you're talking, for example, really, the sub-Saharan areas where I've spent some time. And the issues are totally different. And I think we should not confuse things. Where I think, which my own experience was very clear, we all think about those individuals in the middle of nowhere being able to educate themselves. But because of the technical problem, also the recognition issues, it has probably to go to institutional. So helping the universities over there to provide the courses, to teach the teachers, to kind of lift the whole system is going to be probably, and yes, for example, in our experience at EPFL in Africa, we have, for example, a course on urban cities or on water treatment. So what you could see is, the majority of the students are in institutions. So the free auditors are much lower than they are in our countries, where we have a much more lifelong learners kind of people. So I think that the issues have to be thought through, and they have to be channeled. They have to be organized. That's my impression. And you have to organize it around the clusters that are already present. And in Africa, for example, each country, so we've decided in the western part of Africa also the culture is important. You know, we forget that the western part speaks Wolof whatsoever, but their teaching language is French. A lot of people do not know a word of English. So if you don't go through, you know, the language, you will not. Now, just to give you numbers, the OECD says that there's 750 million French-speaking people in the world in 2050, more than 90% of them in Africa. So if you want to do something about Africa, you probably have to do something in, at least for half of Africa, in French, maybe another one in Portuguese, and you have to go and reach out. And I don't think that you could just, I know the Siemens and Tron said, you know, it doesn't work for developing countries. No, you have to accompany those kind of things. It will not just happen like we, you know, can afford, because we have the bandwidth, we have the education, so I think the issues are very, very different. And I think what we've taught, which I was fascinating, is, you know, India, which is, you know, and when you talk about the IITs, and I know well your institution, those are top institutions. So the issues are very much different. And I think perhaps in China, where there is you know, everybody aspires to get an education and so on, and some of the major issues have been solved. But in Africa, nothing works. So you know, you have to take the problem at the root. And I think, you know, so maybe we're missing at least somebody from Africa around all, but maybe you have a couple of words to add.
To add a bit to that, I do think that that's exactly right. The institutional outreach is going to be critical to build, to make them successful. And so there's one clear, you know, customization, which is the bandwidth issue of making sure that the material is available in low bandwidth settings. What we have found is from Africa, the people that have signed up for our existing MOOC are people who have, they have in some cases better internet access than in some Indian cities, and of course it varies across the continent as well, and we're still talking very small numbers. So the more light you can make from a technical standpoint, the MOOC, the better it is in terms of access. But the second thing is absolutely the outreach to institutions, because there is there's a huge difference, and we saw this in a very different context with school children with the Khan Academy videos, which have huge uptake all over the world. But learners have to be at a point where they can teach themselves. And that comes from being a learner in a particular setting for a fairly long time before they can, they have the confidence, they have the interest, and they have the ability given their day-to-day surroundings. We have people who work 10, 12 hours a day, and then they do all over the world, but these are in very difficult conditions. And then to expect them to have the motivation to log in, to go to a place, to go to an internet cafe nearby, to log on, to see the lectures, to do the assignments is not a very fair expectation. So it has to be in settings where students are already being trained to learn, and I think that is a very big part of it. The third part of it is directly reaching teachers, and I do think that when MOOCs are being designed for learners, it would be good if the MOOC creators can, as the Commonwealth Trust seems to have done, focus on the people who are actually going to teach. That's actually very important, because that will then make sure that the material seeps down, that it's adapted, and that's part of what we're doing. The course we're running right now is being co-taught at 5 universities around the world, and every university has a different experience. In some cases, they're bringing local public intellectuals to debate the lectures. In other places, it's a teaching assistant who's actually teaching the course. In the third, it's being completely co-taught with a faculty who's then adding on assignments, adding on material, so that the student is actually learning, and you can support the student learning as opposed to assuming that the student will learn.
Go ahead. No, I'll just, most of you are from universities who offer MOOCs, or have yourselves offered MOOCs. December 2012, Daphne was in India. We had a gathering of all the vice chancellors and directors of the IITs, and she was speaking to them. And I think they feel threatened. Okay, the people who make MOOCs and the people who are told to consume them and not teach, they feel threatened. We have to bring them in, otherwise they will not tell the students to do the MOOCs. And when you see the MOOC, a student who's come to do the MOOC You've crossed half the battle already. The guy wants to learn. Just getting them motivated to learn is the job of the teacher. You cannot replace that by a MOOC because he won't even come there if he's not motivated. So that part has to be solved. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a basic point, especially the Africa and other. I mean, MOOC is just the latest flavor. I mean, I've been in this online business, went to school in Boston, long time, longer than I cared to mention, where it was called something else. But I think we need to get to the pedagogy. MOOC is just a dissemination tool, as was e-learning, as was computer-based learning, as was video conference-based learning, etc. We need to get to the pedagogy of who's your audience and what are the outcomes and the objectives you want. And then you take the material that the MOOC generates, or however we generate, and then blend it, depending on if it is in a certain part of Africa where storytelling is a very well-liked form of learning. Use those materials to teach it and get it to the learner in the form that makes sense. I mean, you cannot apply the same format, and not to say, I still would like to say that in our 13 years of running online courses in developing countries, we have a fair amount of African participation. But again, they're all policymakers and practitioners who can go to their offices in the government. We're not reaching out to rural areas. But again, if you have to do it in a rural area, then take the material and apply it in different pedagogical ways. So the important point I'm saying is that pedagogy plays a very important role in learning, and we need we don't think enough of that.
Great. In the last answer, I think we'll have to summarize.
I think now the audience for MOOC are adults, because MOOC are higher education, and also usually university just provide videos, but they don't have enough TA or teacher to respond to individual students. So that's really, if you take those lessons to, like, say, Africa or rural China, it's even far away for the teacher or the TA to really reach those regions. So I think MOOC course should really be localized, and also maybe I think at this stage is not the students will not be young kids, but maybe the teachers in the local area. For example, I don't know whether you are familiar with Teach for China, the NGO. So a couple months ago, they had a talk with us. They want to collaborate with us. So they want us to make a list of Coursera courses that can teach their teacher how to be a good teacher, because a lot of their teachers are volunteers locally. So what we are going to do is that we are going to run the learning hubs for their local teachers. So we are being the TA. So I think in order for this MOOC system to reach the rural area, no one organization can solve the whole problem. You have to have a local organization as well as some other one who facilitated it.
Listen, thanks. I think maybe the last...
Just a last point on if you're making a MOOC, please make sure that when you have teaching assistants that you bring on to manage the MOOC, that they can speak multiple languages, and ideally dedicate them to different time zones, because that actually really helps in the discussion fora, where they can engage much more with the students at their timeline, and that works better.
Listen, thanks to all our panelists. I think they deserve a round of applause. And just to say that I think, what is fascinating, 2 years ago, we were just looking about how, will MOOC work, how we're going to do it, and we're thinking about developing countries and so on. I think the panel today shows, the potential, the enthusiasm, but also the complexity of applying those technologies in the developing world. But I think what is, and we've seen yesterday from Daphne, the statistics. You can see that the developing world has grown extremely fast. The potential we know is huge, but I think we have to understand, and I think accompany those MOOCs is something that will be very important, adapted to local needs, and also to get. And I've had the same experience in Africa. You need to have the institutions that are in the education sector to buy in. It can be threatening. As it sees like this, but I think if you if you interact with them and they embrace it, the potential is very big. So I'd like again to thank you for staying late in this afternoon, then wish you a very good afternoon for the rest of the day. Thank you.